All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we're tracking a massive, game-changing transformation that completely redefined our relationship with music, media, and even knowledge itself. We're moving all the way from the sprawling aisles of physical retail empires to the limitless and, honestly, pretty complex frontiers of the digital landscape.
Think about it for a second. When was the last time you bought a physical CD versus just streaming a playlist? So what actually happens when a deeply entrenched, century-old physical empire slams headfirst into the digital revolution? We're going to examine this dramatic collision where technology suddenly allowed the exact same culture to be distributed instantly, globally, and often entirely for free.
What we're looking at here is a fundamental clash. It's the finite reality of physical shelf space versus the completely infinite digital landscape. In the pre-digital era, discovery relied heavily on massive square footage, physical inventory, and local community hubs. But the digital era? It leverages open networks to offer limitless access, on-demand consumption, and user-generated content. It's not just a change in technology, it's a profound shift in who has access and who holds the control.
Let's start by looking at Section 1, the Golden Age of Retail.
Before we can truly wrap our heads around the digital disruption, we have to appreciate just how massive this physical retail empire really was. This wasn't just corporate growth, it was a global conquest. HMV, for example, grew from a single little shop opened by the Gramophone Company way back in 1921 on London's Oxford Street into an absolute global powerhouse. By the 1970s, they had expanded nationwide across the UK. Fast forward to 1986, and they opened what was then the largest record shop in the world. And by the 1990s, they were a massive global presence, expanding into the US and across Asia.
And over in America, Tower Records was echoing this exact same dominance. Founded in 1960 by Russ Solomon, Tower evolved from a teenager selling used jukebox records in his dad's drugstore into a phenomenal juggernaut that brought in over $1 billion, yes, billion with a B, in annual sales. And it was all driven entirely by one defining cultural mantra: no music, no life.
You see, these stores were basically the original social networks for music lovers. They operated with this incredible local-first, independent spirit. You'd walk in and be greeted by deeply knowledgeable audiophiles. They had these long aisles absolutely packed with thousands of titles, and they stayed open late, becoming evening destinations where famous patrons like Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, and Dave Grohl would actually just hang out. Music discovery back then was a completely immersive, tactile experience. But things were about to change. Section 2, the digital disruption. The very foundation of how culture was distributed and controlled was about to shift right beneath the feet of those retail giants. 31.5 million. Think about that number for a second. That is the number of blogs tracked by the search engine Technorati in early 2006. At that time, they were adding 75,000 new blogs every single day. The power to broadcast had officially shifted from corporate boardrooms directly into people's bedrooms. Ordinary folks were suddenly bypassing traditional media gatekeepers entirely to share their own voices, thoughts, and art globally.
It felt like platforms were emerging literally overnight to democratize how we create and share. We saw Flickr hosting tens of millions of digital photos, Wikipedia organizing millions of user-generated encyclopedia entries all over the globe, iTunes bringing on-demand television and music directly to our devices, and YouTube streaming millions of user-generated clips daily. Culture was no longer just a one-way street of consumption, it was being actively created and shared by the masses.
And this perfectly illustrates what's known as the long tail theory, which really explains why the physical model started to break. Look at it this way. A massive physical superstore, despite its size, is inherently limited by its footprint, right? They capped out at around 130,000 titles. But a digital retailer can effortlessly carry 500,000 or more titles. So what does this actually matter? Because while the physical store has to rely on massive, mainstream hits to justify shelf space, the digital platform can aggregate the sales of hundreds of thousands of niche, lesser-known titles. That's the long tail, which together often actually out-earn the massive blockbusters. Physical stores simply could not compete with an infinite digital shelf.
Which brings us to Section 3, the copyright battleground.
So, as distribution became totally frictionless, things got complicated. Rights started fragmenting. The battle over who actually controls the culture really heated up. New stakeholders, bloggers, digital users, independent creators, emerged out of nowhere to challenge the traditional, centralized control held by large industry associations.
The digital world made sharing effortless, which naturally clashed directly with traditional, restrictive copyright frameworks.
A really prime example of this tension actually played out in Canadian politics. During a national election, incumbent politician Sam Bolt, who is a strong proponent of strict DMCA-style copyright laws, held a fundraiser backed by major entertainment industry lobbyists. Well, the blogosphere immediately reacted. They launched online petitions and mobilized voters en masse. This online momentum was so intense that it forced mainstream media to cover the story, which ultimately contributed to a huge election upset and Bolt's defeat. It just goes to show that digital users had suddenly become this incredibly organized, powerful political stakeholder.
So what we're really seeing here are two completely competing philosophies of culture emerging side by side. On one hand, you have the traditional DMCA approach, the all rights reserved model, focusing on strict technological control and anti-circumvention to protect monopolies. On the other hand, you have the Creative Commons approach, some rights reserved, which actively embraces the digital era's capacity for open access, sharing, and collaborative creation.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, the fall of the giants.
While all these intense digital and legal battles were raging online, physical retailers were facing a total existential crisis on the high street. Unable to compete with the digital tide and shifting consumer habits, the harsh financial reality finally set in. By January 2013, HMV was forced to appoint Deloitte as administrators. Later that year, they were briefly saved when Hilco Capital took ownership in a £50 million rescue deal, but unfortunately, the relief was pretty temporary. Facing a tsunami of online retail competition, HMV plunged into administration for a second time in 2018.
And we really can't forget the human cost here, 4,350. That's the number of UK employees left at immediate risk of redundancy during HMV's first administration alone. Behind all the tech disruption and the fascinating long-tail economics, there were thousands of local jobs and beloved community hubs that were rapidly vanishing.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, the physical revival.
But wait, the story absolutely does not end with a complete digital takeover. There is a deeply optimistic and honestly somewhat surprising twist to how we consume culture today. In early 2019, Canadian retailer Sunrise Records, led by Doug Putman, stepped in to rescue HMV. Putman banked on the idea that physical retail holds a unique, enduring place in our culture. He famously stated, "Talk about the demise of the physical business is sometimes a bit exaggerated. We'll be here for quite some time." He clearly recognized that while digital provides the access, physical provides the experience.
And this survival isn't just some fleeting wave of nostalgia. It is backed by very real demand. 500,000. That is how many vinyl LPs were sold by Sunrise Records in their Canadian locations in just a single year, 2017. It turns out that in an era full of invisible digital files, people deeply crave something tangible to hold, collect, and display. These stores basically had a realization they couldn't beat the internet, so instead they offered what the internet literally cannot provide, a tactile, curated experience. HMV's modern adaptation includes leaning heavily into the massive global vinyl revival. They've actually managed to reopen their original highly iconic 363 Oxford Street location. They've opened the massive HMV Vault in Birmingham, which is billed as Europe's biggest entertainment shop, and they're even expanding the brand back out into international markets like Europe and Canada.
So we've traced this entire journey from massive physical monopolies to total digital disruption and now right back to this curated physical revival, which leaves us with this final provocative thought to ponder. In a world of completely infinite digital choice, is the physical record store actually more essential than ever? The enduring desire for human connection, tangible art, and local community suggests that the answer just might be yes. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped map out the incredibly evolving landscape of how we connect with culture.